Hello, hello. Welcome to another edition of the Miss Texas Show with your co-host Melissa Santana. Always excited to be here with you, have another great guest, have another great conversation, and just all of those wonderful things. And so today we have a wonderful guest by the name of Leslie Morgan Steiner. Leslie is an amazing writer. Not only has Leslie produced some great books as well, like is the author of actually four nonfiction books, but also has written over 500 columns, has a bachelor's in English from Harvard College, has been on many TV shows, including The Today Show, National Public Radio, Anderson Cooper 360, serves as a board member for the One Love Foundation, does many, many things. And so with that, we're super excited to have Leslie on the show with us today and tell us a little bit more about her and her incredible journey. Looking forward to it.
This show is a voice of hope for victims, survivors, advocates, and community leaders against gender-based violence to share their stories and resources. Began showcasing life in Texas. Today we are impacting lives not only in Texas, but also around the world. Under our segment Military Time, we run this segment in partnership with the National Veterans Chamber of Commerce. Invite military and veterans who have overcome traumatic events to share their experiences during and after their military service. Under our beauty segment, we invite fellow pageant winners and contestants, artists, musicians, actors, models, and dancers, and last but not least, our survivor leaders from family violence, sex trafficking, sexual assault, stalking, and other traumatic events who are ambassadors for these causes to share their lives and the impact they have made. To become a guest on our show, email us at msusatexas@gmail.com. If you would like to support victims and survivors of gender-based violence, make a tax-deductible donation to Hope Picks Global at www.hopeyxglobal.org.
Hello again, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Miss Texas Show. We are always excited not only to have you, but also to be able to have another wonderful guest. And today, we have truly a treat for you all because we have a tremendous and wonderful guest with us today by the name of Leslie Morgan Steiner. Leslie has done incredible accomplishments, if I can get that out, because apparently I can't speak in the evenings, but is a New York Times best-selling author, a columnist for the Washington Post, speaker on work-family balance, which is something we can all, learn more about. So I hope you tell us more about that today. A successful corporate executive, but also a domestic violence survivor. Along with that, Leslie is the author of four nonfiction books, including the New York Times best-selling memoir, Crazy Love, the critically acclaimed anthology, Mommy Wars, stay-at-home and career moms face off on their choices, their lives, their families, and then The Baby Taste, How Surrogacy is Transforming the American Family, along with her latest memoir, The Naked Truth, which explores female sexuality, self-esteem, and dating after 50. Super, super cool. And so also has written over 500 columns. No small feat or anything like that. But has also been a regular guest on numerous shows, including The Today Show, National Public Radio, Anderson Cooper 360. The list goes on. But also serves as a board member for the One Love Foundation, which I think is wonderful. I love One Love. But also in honor of University, Virginia Senior Yearly Love. So I just, love that organization, but also love that you support them as much as you do. Lives in Washington, D.C., New York, and New Hampshire, so also spreads time, but has a wealth of information to share with us. So with that, Leslie, thank you so much, not only for all the great things and how you've impacted society, but also just for taking the time to be with us today and to tell us more about yourself. That is actually my first question to you is, could you let viewers know just who you are, more about your journey, more about you, and just anything you care to share?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. I'm delighted to talk about my work, which basically focuses on women and the experience of being female in America. And I've always been interested in women, starting with studying my own mom when I was a little girl growing up, and just looking at the choices that she made in terms of career and family and how she loved being a mom, but it was also very stressful. And it was clear to me that she'd given up a lot of things because of it. And I also studied her relationship with my dad. They were married for a long time, divorced after 32 years. And so she was sort of my first subject. And since then, I've really studied women and written about the experience of being female. And my topics have ranged from eating disorders, which was the first thing that I ever wrote about when I was a freshman at Harvard College, and it was published in 17 magazine, which led to me getting a job there, which was really launched my career as a journalist. I've written a lot about relationships. Crazy Love is essentially about the worst relationship that I ever had, a very physically violent and abusive relationship with my first husband. I've written about baby making and parenting and how we juggle work and family. And then my latest, I got divorced for the second time at 49. And it kind of naturally turned my mind to studying older women and relationships and sexuality, and how our country believes that women should be invisible, and that there's a lot of change going on, that women don't want to be invisible, and they don't want to fit into sort of grandmother stereotypes. They want to just continue to be themselves. And I like to champion that. So I'm an advocate for female empowerment in every way, mostly through my writing and through the TED Talks that I do. I've done a TED Talk on why domestic violence can stay for so long. And then I also did a TED Talk about my third book, The Baby Chase, which is about surrogacy and infertility.
Wonderful. Oh, and that was the part I missed. I'm sorry, viewers. I'm for neglected to mention the TED Talks because, of course, no, absolutely. Those are, I mean, being able to even, have a TED Talk at all, honestly, is an amazing accomplishment. But then it being viewed by so many. So definitely, if I'm not mistaken, was it 7 million maybe at least views that it's got?
It's 7 million viewers in something like 40 countries. TED Talks have incredible reach. It's a wonderful marketing tool and communication tool, and it's free, of course. And it's just like a little mini education session in everything that you need to know about getting inside the head of a domestic violence victim.
Absolutely. See, and if you don't mind, being that you are a domestic violence survivor, and being that, we champion that also on the show, and we just, we really appreciate the opportunity to, interview those who are survivors, who are living life on the other side and all those things. If you don't mind walking us, I would say going back maybe to the first marriage, essentially. And so where your journey with that started, but then also, eventually we can talk about how you overcame it and all those things as well. Sure.
So the book that I ended up writing is called Crazy Love. But it didn't start out, I didn't start out thinking, I'm going to write a book about domestic violence, and then it's going to turn into a TED Talk and get all this acclaim. What happened to me is I had just graduated from Harvard College, and I had moved to New York for that job at 17 magazine. And I hadn't dated that much in college. I was just busy writing and working and figuring myself out. So when I hit New York, I just felt like, okay, I'm going to date a lot. And I dated really wonderful men, and it was great. And to my shock, I fell deeply, deeply in love with one of them. And he also had just graduated from an Ivy League school. He worked at a big investment bank, and he was a magical human being. He made me feel like the most beautiful woman in the world, the most cherished and valued. He acted all the time like I was the best thing that ever had happened to him. And he really saw me. He knew that I wanted to be a writer. He told me that I was going to be a great mother one day, which is a very intoxicating thing to be told when you're 23. He was really a funny, smart, self-deprecating, great. And I fell in love with him like I had fallen off a cliff. And along the way of falling in love with him, he told me something that he didn't tell many people, which is that he had been terribly physically abused as a child. And I don't mean that he was spanked. He had his arm broken, his collarbone, his ribs, his nose. His mother was beaten in front of him on a regular basis, all at the hands of his stepfather. And I didn't realize that this was a huge red flag. It just made me love him more and have more respect for him, that he had overcome this terrible traumatic thing that had happened to him. And he told me all the time that violence against women was awful, and that anybody who did it should be severely punished. So of course I thought he would never do it to me. And we got engaged, and then we're on our way to getting married. And he attacked me for the first time 5 days before our wedding. And it was horrific. He strangled me, and he really lost control in a really terrifying way. And I didn't know what to make of it because we had a really good relationship, I thought. There was a lot of laughter and really intense connection, physical and sexual and emotional and psychological. And there was no doubt in my mind that I'd never loved anybody as much as I loved him. So I thought, everybody says that men just get cold feet before they get married. That must be what this was. With his traumatic childhood, he was afraid of becoming a family with me. I made all of these excuses. And I thought because I was strong and smart and come from a solid family, that I could take it, I could handle it, and that I could heal him, that I could show him what true love was all about. And so 5 days later, the bruises on my neck had just healed. And I put on my mother's wedding dress and I stood up in Harvard's Memorial Church and I married him. And I was positive that he was never going to do it again. That there was no way he was going to risk losing me and what we had together. But it was as if a dam had broken, and he beat me twice more on our honeymoon. And when we got back from the honeymoon, we just settled into this life where several days a week he would be great. It's kind of his old self. And several days a week he would be angry and self-pitying and have a hair trigger temper. And he just beat me all the time. And it was not predictable. I couldn't avoid it. He flew off the handle at the strangest things, like if I cooked a meal that he didn't like, or if I forgot to buy milk at the supermarket, or if somebody was passing me in traffic. I remember once I was taking a bath and he poured cold water on me as I was lying in the bath. He poured coffee grinds on my head one day when I was getting ready for a job interview. Like, it was the kind of thing that a 4-year-old child would do, not an adult man. And it was intensely confusing. And it actually was not scary because it had built up kind of so slowly, and I was really numb to it. And I wasn't about to tell anybody because I knew exactly what was going to happen. I knew that he would be arrested, that he'd get in trouble, that the marriage would end. And I wanted the abuse to stop, but I didn't want the relationship to stop because I really loved him and believed in him. So I stayed and I stayed and I stayed until I couldn't stay anymore. And what saved me, which is often what will save almost any domestic violence victim, is that I had friends who, of course, everybody cared about me, but I had friends who cared, who also knew how to confront me. And they confronted me in a very gentle and constructive way, without shaming me, without blaming him, with just sort of letting me know they knew something had changed, that something was wrong, and that I needed help, and they wanted to help me. And then I also, the violence was getting worse. It was undeniably getting worse. The beatings were getting more and more savage. And I knew I couldn't have children with him because I knew he would do it to them too. And I just couldn't do that. I could not do that. And so I eventually came to the terrible realization that I had to leave him, even though I loved him, even though I believed in him and wanted to help him, that I was probably the last person on earth who could help him. And so our second year at Wharton Business School, I made the decision to end the marriage. And I'd like to tell you that that's when things got really easy, but that's not what happened. It got even harder then, which is typical for a domestic violence survivor. The most dangerous time in an abusive relationship is right after you end it. That's when 70% of the domestic violence homicides happen. And in my case, it was no different. He stalked me for a long time. He begged me to get back together. He tried everything that he could possibly do to force me to stay with him. And it took an entire, really like a virtual army of family and friends and strangers, domestic violence advocates, lawyers, police officers, my professors at school, everyone who had to support me to help me get out. It's very, very difficult to leave a crazy love situation. And eventually I did. And I rebuilt my life. It wasn't easy, but I did it. And then a few years later, I started writing Crazy Love because I was so confused how this had happened to me. I'm smart and I like myself and I love my family and I had a good relationship with my father and my mother. And how did this happen? And so I wrote it, and it took 10 years to write the book. And it was like a massive therapeutic deep dive. And I figured it out. And then the day that it was published, to my amazement, it was a New York Times bestseller. It turns out that a lot of people hunger to try to understand what goes on behind closed doors in these really mystifying relationships. And then I became an advocate, and I started talking a lot about it. And that's still what I do today. And it's not the work that I ever thought I'd be doing, but I love it because it helps people, it helps me. And the greater domestic violence community is an amazingly powerful and compassionate, grounded, authentic community. And I'm lucky to be a part of it. So there we have it. That's 30 years of my life in 10 minutes.
No, and I appreciate it, absolutely, and I thank you so very much for sharing that. Just because some viewers may have read the book already. I mean, being that it is a New York Times bestseller, but others may be meeting you, for the first time, and just to get that history and humanistic side of it. You know what I mean? When you see it like beyond just the pages and beyond what's written there, I certainly appreciate it because that is what I see in myself as well. So like as you were saying it, I was like, oh, I see myself there too. And it's just so many times where we just want to assist that other person. And it's like you said, I mean, it's absolutely not something we should fire ourselves for, wanting to care and wanting to see that good in that other person and all of that. But when it is coming at our own expense and our own mental health and our own peace and honestly our own safety. And so that is what I think, where it happens. And so and I think what's incredible though, and incredibly fascinating is that for you, so that was my experience as well, because I know you're also probably meeting me for the first time. We had never, we've never met. And so I was also a domestic violence survivor. That was the violence that I survived. And so I had actually, it did run in my family, though. So there was at least domestic violence there. There was at least this pattern. But you just mentioned, you didn't have that necessarily. You know what I mean? There wasn't necessarily this platform that introduced you to it. You didn't necessarily you had certain relationships that were supportive. So when you have, you have these certain things in place, usually you don't necessarily it's not necessarily a recipe for you to end up in something dangerous like that, but it can, I just love that it sheds light on the fact that it can happen to anyone. That's the whole point. There isn't this recipe of a victim. There also isn't this perfect recipe of a person who does this either. So in his case, he has seen abuse. For others, I mean, they can, but sometimes they don't. I mean, it's just their, it's also their reaction of choice. And so there's just so many things that go into it. So I just really appreciated hearing that, and just hearing that even in the midst of having that is why we cannot blame ourselves when these things happen. This is why, because unfortunately it can happen to anyone. And unfortunately, it's also whoever that person has access to at that time. And so in your case,
it's really true. And I often think that the people who are most vulnerable are people like you who might have grown up with it. So there's something about it that feels normal or familiar, or people like me who didn't grow up with it. And so we have this naive arrogance that it could never possibly happen to us because it only happens to other people. You know what I mean? And both of those are views that are based in shame and blaming women. And it's just not accurate. No victim is ever at fault. There is nothing that you did or that I did or that anybody does that merits being beaten or having guns held to our heads or even being emotionally abused. That is 100% on the abuser. It's their responsibility and their responsibility to change it. And it's hard to get help as an abuse victim, but it's even harder to get help when you're an abuse perpetrator. It's really not understood very well. And people usually aren't looking for help, but the few that are looking for help to break this pattern, they have a tremendously difficult time finding mental health or support group sensitivity and guidance to help them stop abusing. And we're never going to end abuse unless we start focusing on perpetrators and why they do what they do and how to get them the help that they need to break that pattern.
I absolutely agree. And I feel like it needs to be definitely a part of this, whole, conversation that we're having. And so agreed. I mean, we're definitely doing a disservice if we don't, and make sure that the focus is also absolutely there. But the other thing too that I wanted to also highlight is because of course it was another incredibly fascinating thing to hear is that, and I don't know if everybody knew this, but that it took you 10 years, a whopping 10 years to complete this incredible book, which obviously as you saw, it was incredibly well received. there was an audience waiting for you at the end of that finish line, who felt so validated, by what you wrote, probably saw themselves in what you wrote, probably saw, maybe people they knew and all of that. But I just think that part. So I think, and, because I especially want to speak to those who are readers, but also to those future writers, right, who might be sitting on a project as well, and who also, it might be difficult for them also to get it out, or, whatever message you might have for them. But I just wonder what that part of that journey was like. And then, and when you say 2 years, is it because you would take some time, you would take breaks? I'm just curious about the journey in general.
Well, it took 10 years because writing about trauma is always difficult. It's painful and it's a hard story to tell. So I think that fundamentally that is what was hard about it. But there was also this deeply therapeutic process going on, which is, first I had to figure out how to tell the truth. And then I had to look at the drafts that I'd written and say, is that really accurate? And it sounds so easy, but it wasn't. And I must have written 50 drafts of Crazy Love, because things happened like the first several drafts, the way I wrote my own character, no one would like that person. I came off as really elitist and sort of cold and superior, things that I'm not. And I finally realized that it was because I was very angry at myself, and that it showed in the writing. I was furious with myself that I had done something so stupid. That of the 8 million people in New York City, I had fallen in love with one of the most disturbed and one of the angriest. And that I had to forgive myself before I write a sympathetic character of myself. And I actually had a dream one night where I woke up yelling, well, not yelling, but sort of shouting, I forgive you. I forgive you. Because it was that powerful in me. And after I forgave myself, I was able to write who I really am, and who I was at the time, which was a 23-year-old who just graduated from college, who was in love for the first time and missed every red flag out there just because she was young and passionate and forgiving and, wanted to believe the best in this man. And you said, that it's not a bad quality, that, and it's true. It's like I have a son and 2 daughters, and I raised them to be the same way. But what you also said is critical, and that's the lesson that I learned in the abusive relationship and in writing Crazy Love, is that it's incredibly important to take care of yourself, to take care of your own mental and physical safety. And that's really job one for all of us. And most women and some men in our country are not taught that. We're not taught that we are valuable too. And you just get in a lot of trouble if you don't value yourself, especially in an intimate relationship, because they are so confusing at times, and they can be you can lose yourself so easily in love, and it feels wonderful, and sometimes it feels awful. So that's a little bit of why it took 10 years. I also found that it was good as part of the writing process to take breaks, to put the manuscript aside for even 6 months and then look at it with fresh eyes. And I was being pregnant and giving birth to and raising 3 kids during that time. I was working full time at the Washington Post. So there was a lot of other stuff going on that was good and healthy. And I think it helped me write a better book, but it explains why it took so long to do it. And you don't always have the luxury of having 10 years to write a book, but I'm really glad that I did, because I'm really happy about every word in that book. There's not anything that I would change in it.
Absolutely. And I just think that that's just such a, a beautiful, a beautiful way of capturing, all of that and how you were able to do that. But I think, I just really appreciate, that brutal honesty at the beginning of where you were when you started, and just and how, it's not in there now, because I probably was in draft 48 or 40, like you said, because there was 50 drafts. But it's just incredible too that as a writer, because this is definitely literally as you were writing that, you were working for the Washington Post as a writer. So this is what you do. It's obviously a very therapeutic tool, like you said. but for it to also, as you are on your journey, like, for you to be able to do that. And so, like, not only work through that, but then be able to, capture how you have, that process behind that, and, being able to, like, share that with others, and how, like you said, there are parts that, we don't need to necessarily fault ourselves for. I mean, yes, we absolutely need to, keep that critical eye and know, but there are these parts of ourselves that are beautiful, and that, we definitely see great in others, and that, and because of that, we can channel that into positive energy that we can then use, and just, making sure that we don't, lose ourselves in the midst of wanting to help others. But I agree that love in general, Crazy Love was definitely a wonderful title, and it's just such a great, because not like an oxymoron or anything like that. It really just depicts it. I mean, because it really is, it's this incredible emotion that takes you on, to high places, but it can also take you to incredible lows. And so, it's just something that, and then what I love about love in general too is that very often we do equate it to romantic relationships, and it is there, but love is also crazy even with our other relationships, and, with our platonic relationships, with our family members. And so, in general, it's just great to be able to feel these emotions and work through them. Like, there's definitely value in doing that because of the power they have, in our lives. And what I'm curious about too is, like you said, definitely I heard therapy. I heard that writing is therapeutic for you. But, like, and it was incredibly helpful to take care of yourself, honor your breaks and do all of those things. But I'm also curious, so, like, what other things did you do then or that you do now to take care of yourself? Because agreed, trauma is not an easy conversation to have. It's not one that we all just, warmly embrace all of the time. I mean, as an advocate, I'm sure, you have these conversations all the time, and I, find myself doing it also. But just what are the ways that you took care of yourself then and continue to do so?
For me, one of the most important things about being married to an abusive man and then leaving him, even though I still loved him, was that I vowed that I would never let anybody abuse me again. And you could call that a boundary issue. You could call it self-esteem. There are a lot of things that you could label it as, but I think that is one of the most important things, is that I don't have anybody in my life who treats me poorly. And there are some times where you have good friends or family members who, because of where they are in life, they're treating everybody badly. And I've learned how to take a step back from people like that. And I'm really happy to report that my life is filled with people who are really loving and positive, and they may have things that they struggle with, but they're not taking their struggles out on me and making me pay for it. They take responsibility for themselves. So I would say that's one of the biggest things. I really believe in doing nice things for ourselves. And this is another thing that I think a lot of women in particular are not encouraged to do. We're encouraged to take care of other people, but not ourselves. So over the course of my life, I've thought a lot about what I love doing. And I have a lot of hobbies. I love to swim. I love to be in nature. I love animals. So I've really tried to fill my life as much as possible with those things. I try to get enough sleep. I try to work out every day. I would say, it's funny. It's a really good question. I'd say that the biggest thing is to try to silence the negative critic in my head. And maybe we all have this, but I have this voice that is always saying to me, you didn't do a good enough job. People hate you. Nobody's going to come to your funeral. It even happened when I'm writing a book. I've written 4 books now, and every book that I've written, I've had like a like a reviewer in my head that has just said these really negative things the whole time. Like with Crazy Love, for some reason, what the negative voice was saying was, this is a really juvenile book. Like it's not nuanced. It's like a young adult book. It's not a grown-up book. And I finally said, okay, fine. Well, it'll be a book for teenagers then. Great. And you know what? It is a book for teenagers. Teenagers love it. But 50-year-old men love it too. And, doctors, lawyers, janitors, everybody really likes it because love is such a universal subject. So I try to go back to those voices and say, look, you actually have been wrong in the past, and I would rather not listen to you now. Can we find something else productive for you to do? Like, can you fold my sock drawer? Like, that negativity is actually useful because it can make you do certain things really well, but I just try not to listen to it when it's being negative about my value as a human being, or how much people love me, or the quality of my work, because somehow that voice is just so negative that I can't trust it. And honestly, I don't know where that voice comes from. I know that almost everybody has a little piece of that. And I wish we could all get rid of it. I think we'd just be so much happier if we didn't have that self-doubt and negativity.
Lord, yes, we need to just write that all down now, all collectively, and just remember that. But I think because that's such a human quality, and we need to recognize too, like, let's normalize that in this conversation now, but also in general. So even, yes, you all are hearing it. You all hopefully know me by now, a little bit about myself, but you're also hearing from a New York Times bestseller, a person who is a mother, who has done all these wonderful accomplishments. Doesn't mean that you're immune to that negative voice in your head, like you just shared it with us. And so I really appreciate, once again, that you didn't mind that transparency there, because I agree. And I think too, what I was thinking about as you were saying it is definitely not whether or not I have one, because I already know I do. So like, I definitely have a negative voice also, but just that, where does that always come from too? So like for me, I think, right. It always, sometimes it can just be ourselves, like it's just being critical of ourselves, because it is easier to do so. And just knowing that regardless of where it comes from, and if you've also had trauma in your life, you also know that the negative voices definitely stem from that also, just because, you've lived that, that's been part of your lived experience and all those things. But it's also just the fact that when we're going to pin positive against negative voices are always going to be louder, just in general. They tend to definitely be ones that, tend to have more volume, but also if we believe them, we also tend to give them not only more value, but more power. And so I think it was just wonderful to hear not only that, you didn't mind sharing that you have it, but that you've really been actively working on not letting it win, and, really like putting it into more productive use, because it can, and it can really overpower, because our minds are that powerful. And so, doing that. But you also mentioned, like you said, that you've written plenty of other books since then and all of those things. And that's what I'm also curious about. Like, do you always have you written them in between other projects? Have some of them, like, from start to finish, you just kind of like had to, bang it out? Or like, what did it look like creating the other books that you've also done and made?
I also wrote Mommy Wars when I was working full-time at the Washington Post, and I was raising my 3 kids. So I would write every night between like 9 p.m. and midnight after the kids were asleep. I was really driven to write both Mommy Wars and Crazy Love. And I think it's a wonderful experience when you're that obsessed with a project that you just sort of can't wait to get to it. And I remember there would be times where I'd be like in a movie theater on a date, and I'd leave the movie theater to write stuff down, or I've left yoga classes to write. I've gotten up in the middle of the night to write. So there have been a couple of the books where I really was just so obsessed in a positive way that I couldn't stop writing. But the one that was the hardest for me, which I wrote in 2 years, start to finish, was The Baby Chase, because that one was a lot about research. It's a story about infertility and artificial reproductive technologies. So it starts with sex, right? Because that's how we make babies. And it ends with babies. So both of those things are really interesting, sex and babies. But all the things in between are really wonky and scientific. And the research was difficult. And then to translate the research into something that someone would actually want to read. It's one thing if you're like studying biology in high school and you have to read it. But my books aren't like that. I've got to entice readers and tell a really good story. So that was more difficult, but also very, very interesting and challenging. And then in some ways, the book that was the most fun to write is the last one that I did, which is The Naked Truth. And that story was that, I got divorced at 49 for the second time. And I had this really audacious idea that I was going to do, as a woman, I was going to do exactly what I'd seen men do my whole life, which is when they got divorced and they're in midlife, they went and they dated, 5 or 6 younger partners for a year. And so I went and did that. I had quote unquote 5 boyfriends. Sometimes I had 0, sometimes I had 10, and they weren't really boyfriends. They were just love interests. And they all happened to be younger. And it was a crazy and wild thing to do. It turns out that many, many, many women do this. But because of social stereotypes, we kind of have to secretly do it and we can't really talk about it. But I've never been secretive. I've never been private. I want to talk to other women about these things. I want to talk to other people about them. And so I've learned since publishing The Naked Truth that so many women did this, and some of them are still doing it. Now, I got kind of sick of it because it was like eating cotton candy every day for a year. The men I dated were delightful and self-confident and very appreciative of women in general, but particularly older women, which was the opposite of what I'd had in my marriage. So it was very healing. And it was kind of ironic to me that as a feminist, that I was turning to men to heal myself, but it's what I needed, and then they did it. And then eventually I got done with the cotton candy of dating younger men, and settled on something more substantial. But it was a really interesting experience, especially to juxtapose it with Crazy Love, because they both in some ways are stories about a woman finding herself. And I think it's the journey in life for just about everybody who's leading a life well lived, is that you're constantly discovering more and more about yourself and about how the world works and what relationships are all about. Like some very fundamental things that I don't know about you. I thought we were sort of born knowing this, that we were born knowing how to love and how to take care of ourselves and it turns out that we're not, that it's what life is about, is learning that. And then maybe teaching our kids and maybe passing it on. And I love the process of writing these things. And the way that the creative process works for me is that I will notice that there is something that I'm obsessed with. Usually it's something that I'm angry about. I think anger is a good divining rod as a writer, as somebody creative, because if you're angry about something, it means that you feel really strongly about it and that you have something to say about it and that you want to delve into yourself and persuade other people to see things differently. So for instance, with Crazy Love, I was very angry when people would say, why doesn't she just leave? And then they would go on to explain, even though they had never been abused in their life and never knew anybody who was, they would explain that women stayed in abusive relationships because they liked it, because they had no self-esteem, because they had too many children, none of which was true. And it made me so angry to be condescended to in that way, that it really fueled me to write Crazy Love, because I wanted people to understand what it's really like to be abused. And I also wanted to reach out to my fellow abuse survivors, so that we could build more of a network together, because there's so much healing power and advocacy power in numbers, as we've seen in the Me Too movement, and in a lot of different movements, that when you break the silence, there's a lot of power on the other side of that. And I think that my books, one way or the other, all of them are books that try to break the silence about certain taboo subjects that we're all better off actually talking to each other about. And a book is a really great vehicle for that, because you write in private and you read in private. And so it's entirely up to you if you want to talk to anybody about it, or if you just want to stay in your nice, safe little brain. So there's inherent consent involved in the process of reading and discussing books. And I like all that. I think that's very healthy and a good way to tackle any kind of problem.
Absolutely. And so, and definitely what I appreciate about that is, so many things, but just that, definitely highlighting the rediscovery. And so there's just so many times during our lives where we can rediscover things about ourselves. We can learn new things. We can unlock like these new levels of potential, and just, I don't know, it doesn't always have to be stagnant. My goodness, you know what I mean? So we're allowed to like learn, as we learn something new, we can also develop new interests around that, you know what I mean? And we can develop things further and, do all of that. But I also had to highlight, or like at least emphasize to what I loved, is that, like you said, your passion projects and how you even left yoga and a date. I think that was like, wow, that's how it was a true passion project, because you even left both of those things, which to some, they're like, nah, when I'm in my class, I'm in my zone, or like on the date. So that's hilarious. But that's how you do it.
I'll be right back. I got to go write something down.
There you go. But you had to. And we needed,
I did.
Definitely that. Yes, exactly. And you can lose that thought in that moment. So
right.
I applaud that.
Right.
So
you have to put it first. That's what I say when people ask me all the time, well, how do you become a writer? And I say, you just write. But it sounds so simple, but you do have to just write. And when you have a thought, you've got to write it down. You can't wait, because it might be gone forever. And it's much easier, rather than sitting down at the computer and like praying to the writing gods or trying to dredge stuff up. It's much easier to just take it when the inspiration comes right through you, even if it's 1 a.m, or even if you're at the movies or in an exercise class. Or I pull off the road a lot, because I'll be in the car and I'll think, ooh, and I have pads of paper everywhere. And now that I write on my phone a lot, that's saved things. I mean, that's incredible to always essentially have a little mini computer with you so that you can write.
Absolutely, it does help, and definitely. And then there's also such incredible apps on there that capture it. But even the simple ones, just notes, just pulling out your notes on your phone.
Right.
If
Yep.
you did not
Yep.
know,
Yep. Yep.
exactly, we keep it digital. It has that wonderful copy. So definitely agreed. And that's what I think is wonderful about what you're sharing is that. So if you have this inkling, and I've heard it from others who have seen. Now that we've had more conversations, I've heard women say things like, and not just women, in general, those who have said, I feel like I have a story to share, I'm afraid, I'm not sure how, all that. Like you are saying, I feel like let's not worry about those things. Let's not worry about how it's going to be received, but more about, just truly honoring the essence of that story and letting that story be told, period, and however we want that to happen. But definitely if you feel like you have a story to share, it's because you do. And it definitely has value. And there are definitely people who are going to want to receive that and who can resonate with that. And even if they don't, I mean, the good thing is it's going to be good for you, to also get that out if you have that desire.
I think it is the highest form of self-care is to tell your story and to silence those voices that say, it's not an important story. You're not supposed to air your dirty laundry. I told you not to tell. There are a lot of roadblocks to writing about trauma. But I think I see again and again in the people who I work with that it's so empowering to get the story out. And some people want it to be published. Some people want to share it with the world. Other people don't. And either way is fine. There's something inherent to the writing process and to the storytelling process that is important. And I think if you look at us as human beings, long before we could actually write things down, we communicated knowledge through storytelling. And it's a way to remember the important lessons of your life is by telling the stories. Even if you're just telling it to yourself, you're the most important audience. And it's just really powerful and healing. And I recommend it to anybody who feels like you have a story to tell. Tell your story, find a way to do it. There are so many ways to do it today. You can write it, you can do a TikTok on it, you can do a Facebook post. You can write a poem, you can share these things with other people or just share it with yourself. But the story, to get the story out it's pretty powerful. And I think it's really almost magical.
Can't agree more. Absolutely. And there's definitely just incredible value in that. And I just definitely can't echo that enough. And so speaking of that, because I feel like you just dropped wonderful gems there and just gave some incredible advice to those who may be, on the brink of having a story and all that. But what I'm also curious about is any advice you have for, those who may be afraid to start over like yourself. I mean, because I think the also incredibly vulnerable thing about what you shared, but also incredibly, powerful thing is that, it doesn't always necessarily work out beautifully. It's not just like, typical story. Like there's like, beautiful recipe. Even with all the therapeutic things that you did, unfortunately, you just happen to get in a relationship and it just happened to not work out again. And so, now you happen to be someone who advises people about what dating looks like, after 50, like you just mentioned. And so for those who may be afraid to start over, I'm just curious, like, what has it been like for you? What kind of helpful gems have you been, harping on or like that you use? But also those who may be afraid, to start over at those ages may feel like, oh, it's too late for me. Like I have no hope. Like, what messages do you have for those people?
Well, I really understand the fear of the unknown and the fear of starting over and the fear of saying, you know what, this didn't work out. Whether you're somebody who's is facing your first divorce or your fifth divorce, failure is never fun. But I happen to think it's much worse to stay in something that's not working for you. There's nothing worse than staying in a chapter of your life that's over. You got to move on. And I guess a piece of advice that I would say is that people aren't actually paying as much attention to us as we think. Like nobody really cares how many boyfriends I've had, how many divorces I've had. I mean, and if they do, it has something to do with them, not me. people care about themselves mostly. All of us are inherently pretty self-centered. So I think that that's kind of a freeing concept, that nobody really cares. And that failure, this is a funny thing. It's very timely, but I just got back from my 30th Wharton Business School reunion. And it was wonderful. I mean, I had a great time at Wharton as an undergrad. University of Pennsylvania is a great school, really smart, amazing people. But what we did for this reunion is that we all shared our failures over the last 30 years. And boy, do we have some doozies. I mean, every single person there has been fired from a job, has driven a company into the ground, has had at least one divorce, has had some problems with their kids. Everybody has faced something. And it was just so fascinating and inspirational to hear my friends and colleagues talk about all the times that we failed. It made me feel so human. And there was so much laughter between us because we just kept picking ourselves up. And I think that's a great way to live, is to say, I don't know, it's like, what do we say to our kids? We say to our kids, it's okay to fail. You learn so much from it. And I don't know about you, but this is my only life in this incarnation. And I don't want to stay in something that's not working for me. And I think it's really dangerous to stay in something that's not working. The only real risk in life is not taking any risks at all. And I think that other people are our saving grace, that if you can connect with other people going through the same thing that you're going through, they will see you through. And there's never been a time in the history of the world that it's easier to connect with people. I mean, even if we go back to like the days when we were all living in tents and teepees and caves together all the time, it's easier to communicate now because of the internet, because there is an anonymous, closed Facebook group for anything. And you can find people to connect with. You can find your support and in ways that feel comfortable to you. And you can get through it with other people. And then you can get through it you can help them get through it too. And I don't know, I love that part of being human, that other people help me and then I help other people and we repeat it until we die. And I think that is a recipe for a great life.
Absolutely. And I think too often too, I mean, like you said, the things that make us human, sometimes we act so ashamed of those things and we act like we're the only ones going through those things. No, not at all. Everybody has faced failure, like you said. Like, it's just wonderful to hear when you can get that validated. But too often I think we almost amplify it in that way to where I must be the only one going through this, and I must be the only one that's like, doing this, or even when it's failing, like I must be the only one failing royally at this in this way. And like, absolutely not. I can guarantee I can find, tens of, and maybe even thousands of individuals who have probably faced that similar situation and have absolutely gone through it as well. But just, that there's, beauty in accepting that, but also just knowing that, those things have happened and admitting it, but not necessarily staying there in the failure either. You know what I mean?
Right. That's true. That's a very good point.
No, and absolutely. And so, yeah, and that's what I appreciate. But I think, like you said, it was there was such freedom behind the fact that you all were sharing failures at that event.
Right.
And I think I've heard of that. Such a Marvel concept, but like the freedom that was actually able to be gained just by being able to share that, we've been there and that we've been at the bottom. Yeah, like I was like, wow. If anything, when I was hearing that, I was like, wow, more events should have that.
I know. I agree with you. I think it's a great theme for events in general. And I just, it's really is so often our mistakes that are very good teachers. And if you think also, like, I remember my first wedding, I tripped really badly going down the aisle, and it was really horrifying at the time, but that is the thing that everybody remembers that made it really special. And it's okay, it's those things that seem so horrifying are really what make us unique and memorable. And I don't know, it's really worth remembering when you're going through it. And I think a lot of the things that I write about, it's times where we felt so alone. As a domestic violence victim, you kind of think you're the only person this has ever happened to. And as somebody who's facing infertility, you feel that way too. You feel like all other women get pregnant so easily, and what's wrong with me? And I'm the only person who's gotten divorced 2 times and has failed miserably, or the only person who is struggling to balance work and family. Everybody else makes it look so easy. All of those things that make us feel isolated and alone, the voices in our head that say that we're the only person doing that, that's the enemy. You want the richest parts of life are connecting with other people. And one of the best ways to connect with other people is to admit that you don't have it all figured out. And I'm somebody who I grew up in a family where it really mattered to present a beautiful presentation every day to the world. Like, we have everything so great. We're all so attractive. We went to great schools. We win every tennis game. We're the president of the PTA. We're all of that. And I think that's all so great in a way. It's achievement, and it's terrific. But it's also really, really good to just say, yeah, you know what? I farted on my first prom date, and the guy heard it and noticed, it's human. It's okay. It's great. And I did.
Absolutely. And I agree. And I just feel like, how else were we supposed to grow if we didn't have opportunities like that? Where we were at one point, exactly, where we failed and all of those things. And then, and then we were able to rise from because also that's the other thing. When you do fail, I mean, the only place you can go is up.
I know, it's true. And it's also, it's a much more interesting thing to write about, is a time that you failed, a time that you were afraid, a time that you didn't know what to do, versus a time that you knew exactly what to do.
Oh, exactly. See, with that being said, I'm definitely very curious. Like, so now, and you've definitely alluded to it, but of course, apparently, you balance being a mom and then also, still having a career, still being a writer. Like, I'm just curious, like, how you're able to, balance all that. I mean, because you did say you talk about work-life balance and all of those things, but what that looks like, and just also what kind of passion projects you see having like later on, and how you're working that in with all the balance that you currently have as well.
So yeah, I have 3 adult children, and they're very, very independent. They were independent as kids, and they're independent as adults. So I love being around them. But the truth is, they don't need that much anymore. They don't need that much of my time or energy or anything else. They're very, very self-sufficient. So it's easier now. But when I was really in the thick of things, when I was a new mom with 3 young kids and a husband he was a very sort of stereotypical husband who really didn't think that he was ever supposed to pitch in on the childcare or the household work or anything. The way that I made it work was that I cut corners. I tried to find the corners that didn't matter. For many years, I was 5 minutes late to every single meeting that I went to, and I left every meeting early because I knew the beginning and the end didn't make any difference. I turned to other moms for help. And I didn't sleep a lot. I think one of the things that's really hard about motherhood, especially in the way that we do it in our country, is that we're so alone in it. Every mom, there's not really a model for how you're supposed to balance career and family. There's a lot of societal pressures and judgment and shoulds, but there isn't a clear path, and every woman does it differently. So you're really always inventing the wheel. And I loved being a mom. I still do. But when my kids were little, I didn't want to give up my career because I loved that too. And I knew economic independence was very important. And investing myself was important, but I wanted to be with my kids as much as possible. And so I used that as the North Star. I just it's one reason why I left the Washington Post to be a full-time writer and speaker, is that it gave me a lot of flexibility. So I worked just as hard as I ever did, but I have a lot more flexibility, which gave me so much time to be there for my kids. And that was my priority. And I'm so glad that I found a way to make it work. And I see so many women who found different ways to make it work, and their kids are great and they're happy. And it's the good news and the bad news. There's no one right way to balance work and family. And I have no idea what I'm going to write about next. I am writing for AARP a lot, and I love doing that because it's all about women and aging issues. And I think that I have another book or 2 in me, but I just don't know at this stage what it is. And I'm I'm just kind of enjoying life. And we'll see what that next subject is when I get to it, when it grabs me by the short hairs and says, write me, write me, write me. I mean, that's a lot what happens, but it just hasn't happened yet.
Okay, see, and then and as you're describing, it doesn't have to, right? Because right now you're at the stage where you're enjoying and you're giving yourself permission to do that, and I think that's wonderful because too often we also don't do that, and I feel like we're also often chasing that next goal or doing all that, but sometimes we don't also enjoy the present, and so like and what that brings and what it's teaching us, and what it is there. So like I love to hear that that's happening and that you're giving yourself this opportunity to still see it, and I just think that's the thing that I've been having to learn too, is that with all these different seasons of our life, there is so much that new season can teach us, and and the old season, prepared us for. And so too often I feel like, we rush through life and don't take the time to reflect on those things and all of that. So I just think it's wonderful to hear, but also, it's just great to know too that, you, like you said, you found ways to be able to make that work and find those joyous times, but you eventually went from having those full-time, like that full-time job, to something that was definitely more freelance, you know what I mean? And like you said, more,
Right.
Like that flexibility. And I think that's another thing that a lot of individuals might be afraid to try and, to really take ownership of, but just, that you gave yourself, like once you did, it just gave you this, tremendous freedom and flexibility that you didn't necessarily have, somewhere
Right.
else. But, but you see both sides.
Flexibility is a very valuable commodity, for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But in the midst of that, like before you got there, you definitely mentioned having to like juggle all those things. And like when you said the like leaving the meetings at the beginning, like at the end, I was like, oh Lord, I know that well too well, all too
I
well.
also, another thing was that I was a terrible cook. I that was the hardest thing about having kids, is cooking breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And my kids will tell you themselves that it was like a lot of tater tots and fish sticks and chicken nuggets in my family. And I just figured they're going to survive this. And the thing that's turned out is that all three of my kids are fantastic cooks. So maybe I did a good thing,
What?
but that was another corner that I had to cut. You can't do everything. You can't be perfect at everything.
Right. Ooh, and that's another one that I feel like we cannot say enough, because that's what I feel like we try to do. We definitely try to do that. We're like, oh no, I can do it all, and I can, and I can fix this, and I can, no. And then we wonder why we feel so depleted. Also,
I know. Yeah.
And so,
trust me, I felt plenty depleted, but at least I held on to my sanity for the most part.
Oh no, amen. And then, but like you said, also, I just think like now, I mean, but I definitely don't see that, with what, the woman I see before me. So I just feel like, now it definitely radiates that you have, lived your life, you know what I mean? That you've actually like really done that.
Right. That's a great point. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I definitely see that, but I also just love what I just heard about, your future too, that it's not necessarily prescribed. You have not written it the same way you've written all these books.
Right.
So like it's not written. There's also some parts that you're allowing just to come to you and to be able to naturally find you. Exactly. And I think that's going to be a wonderful thing. I can't wait to see what that's going to, look like, because, I feel like those are the best things, honestly. Like
sometimes they really are. I agree with you so much. I know, I'm looking forward to it too. And in the meantime, as you said, I'm just enjoying the present. It's pretty good.
Exactly. And I think that's never a bad thing at all. And so with that, I think, I've learned so much, I hope other, viewers have as well. But I definitely, if there's, like, since they've gotten this opportunity, I definitely want to give you room to be able to let everyone know how to connect with you.
Yes. Oh, that's so nice of you. Yeah. Thank you. So I am really easy to connect with. I have a website, lesliebooks.com, and my email is there and all of my work is there. And then on Facebook, it's Leslie Morgan Steiner. And then on all the other social medias, my tag is at Leslie Books, the same as my website. And I love to connect with people. I think it's, whether or not you've read my books or seen my TED Talks, doesn't matter. Please friend me and come see me, and let's continue the conversation.
Absolutely. And especially if you're like a future writer, I would encourage you, but also if you're a current fan or a future fan, like definitely,
exactly.
I feel like
yes,
for all those reasons and more, and just for that genuine connection. Absolutely. And so
well, thank you so much. I've really loved this conversation. It's really great. I really appreciate your time.
Oh, definitely. awesome. And you, is there any last words that you had for the viewers? Any other, thoughts?
Mm. Hmm. I think, it is such a cliche to go after your dreams, because I don't think it's quite that simple. But I would say that if there's something in you that says, I have to do this, I have to do this, listen to it and see where it takes you. Because that's why I published my first book, is that I had always wanted to be a writer. And just as I got older and older, I thought, I can't live my life without writing a book. I've got to do it. And lo and behold, 15 years later, I've written 4 books. And it was all because I paid attention to that voice. So I'd say if you've got that good voice in you, listen to that one even more than you listen to the negativity ones.
Oh, couldn't have said it better myself. And so absolutely. And so I just think that, too often, we don't always hear that. And so I think, if this was your sign to be able to listen to that today, please take it as such, because it is your sign, right, to be able to do that and fuel that passion project. Fuel whatever passion project is going to have you leaving a yoga class or a date. You heard it today.
That's great. I love
Fuel
that.
One. Absolutely, definitely. And so thank you very much, Leslie, for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. And thank you all for tuning in, as always, and we always appreciate your support.